It's my great pleasure to introduce you our second keynote speaker, Professor Fania Oz-Salzberger, who was so very kind to join us for today and talk to you on a crucial topic between Israel and Europe. I am also grateful because this is one of the highlights of Israel Week at Charles University, which all of you know is now this year we celebrate our 5th anniversary, and because I assume that most of you are well familiar with Professor Oz-Salzberger, I will say just a few words I can mention two points which curricula. Fania Oz-Salzberger is an Israeli historian, writer, and public intellectual. She has been professor of history at the University of Haifa since 1993, member of Faculty of Law, and Center for German and European Studies, and founding director of Posen Research Forum for Political Thought. Her books include Translating the Enlightenment, Israelis in Berlin, and Jews and Wars, co-authored with Amos Oz, her father. She has published dozens of academic articles, most recently on the political thought of Isaiah Berlin. Professor Oz-Salzberger served 5-year term as professor and Leo Lieberman Chair in Modern Israel Studies at Monash University in Melbourne, and held the Lawrence Rockefeller Visiting Professorship for Distinguished Teaching at Princeton University. She was director of Paideia, the European Institute for Jewish Studies in Sweden, and visiting professor in Israel Studies at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. All of you had Professor Oz-Salzberger bio also included in your conference file, so please have a look at this point. And now it's my great honor to invite Professor Fania Oz-Salzberger, and the floor is all yours. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Marcella. Thank you all for having me here for a very short time. First of all, let's make sure that you hear me and that there is no secret or sub button that creates some buzzing in the microphone. With the salt, you can hear me and even see me. I am touched to be in Prague. It's definitely not my first time. I'm just giving two tiny chunks of memory to open with. First of all, how when I was a little girl, I heard for the first time about Prague without even giving the name Prague. I was 7 or 8 years old. I was in the kibbutz. In the kibbutz we lived in a children's house. And one morning our energetic and also metapel, our caretaker, one of the female staunch pioneers who founded the kibbutz, already quite a lady in years and a very tough lady, woke us up in the morning, not with her usual good morning, get up, but by crying. She was crying almost hysterically and saying to the other caregiver in the kindergarten, "Damn those Soviets, damn those Soviets." I and we, the children, had never heard the word Soviets and had never heard the word damn, as I said. And so we went and started asking questions, and that was how I heard about Prague for the first time on the day that the tanks drove in here. One of my earliest childhood memories. The second is a much better memory, not for myself, from my father, who was a guest of President Václav Havel in very different days in Czech history. And they were over there in the castle, spending the night, drinking alcohol, talking about literature, and exchanging obscene jokes. So I said to my father, you don't do that sort of thing. He said, yes, but Václav was so persuasive. And so I said to my father, I hope he didn't drag you to that room with the famous window from which sometimes people are thrown down. And he said, oh no, we were drinking in his own office. This was a very different Prague from the Prague of my first childhood memories, and whenever I come back here, I am touched and tearful as to the change, the transformation that this place has gone through. And it is one of the good transformations in this world, not one of the bad transformations on which I shall be speaking. So this lecture, which is serious and it's late in the day, and I will perhaps not read the full text, but I will give you the main pointers. To begin with, my topic is Israel and Europe, a crucial conversation in a complicated era. And I should have three main headings. That's the Israeli way to do it. First of all, I will try to see what is permanent here and what is fluid. What has remained staunchly true and relevant in Israeli-European relations since the early Zionism, since the Holocaust, since early Israel. What has remained and what has changed? What is constant and what seems to be fluid? That's my first heading. My second heading is the return of the leader. Here I want to make an about turn and say something serious and not altogether joyful about our age being the age of strong one-man leaderships rather than civil society and NGOs and people to people. I'm trying to work this idea out. It's not a very encouraging idea, but it is maybe a temporary era in our lifetimes. And finally, my final subchapter will be leading the Israeli-European conversation today and tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning for me as an Israeli is next week, Wednesday morning, after our general elections, but who knows? Who knows? But I will begin with my father. I don't usually begin lectures or keynotes with my father. I've never done so before, but now I feel that I can, and maybe even that I'm morally obligated to speak a little bit in his voice before I go on to speak in my voice. The last public lecture he ever gave in Israel, in Tel Aviv, at Tel Aviv University, was entitled, "The Reckoning is Not Over Yet. כל החשבון עוד לא נגמר." It was only last June, Tel Aviv University, and he named this lecture after Yosef Chaim Brenner's novella, that some of you may know, titled Ad Hena, Up Until Here, where the last sentence is כל החשבון עוד לא נגמר. All the reckoning is not over, meaning history is, or personal human life is open-ended, as long as there is life. And my father, in this last lecture of his, which was almost wholly political, made his last reckoning with you as an Israeli, as a Jewish Israeli, but in a new sort of way, because in this part of the lecture he was addressing the Israeli Jews of Mizrahi origin, addressing the prevailing sense of resentment some of them have towards the Ashkenazi expressions of either superiority or seniority. We Ashkenazis were the first to lead Zionism, we were the first to come to the land of Israel in modern times, which is historically, of course, not totally true, but there is a prevailing sense that Ashkenazi Zionists were the first to come up with modern Jewish nationhood, and the first to return to the land of Israel under the Zionist mantle. This was part of a new conversation that Amos Oz had just begun with Mizrahi Israelis. He heralded it long ago in his book In the Land of Israel, but only in the middle of this decade, and believe me, he didn't know that he was going to die. He thought he was opening some new conversations, among them one very personal, very deep, with Mizrahi Israelis. And the one book that came out with this very wonderful, very last book is called Mima Asu Mi HaTapuach, in English, Walks in the Apple, based on his conversations with his former editor, Shira Haddad. It was too late in a way. He began to develop a new conversation. He began to enhance his listening to his Israeli Mizrahi interlocutors, but his time ran out. And then he says the following, and this is about Ashkenazi Jews, really, but it is a way of addressing the so-called seniority, having come up with the Zionist idea first, or having come to the land of Israel first. And he said, and I quote, my translation is still not appeared in English, it's being translated now, I translated from Hebrew. The only reason why East European Jews came here first, and most Jews from the Mizrach came later, and are a little indignant on this issue, is not that the Mizrahi Jews had a slower grasp and did not understand, and not that they loved the land of Israel less than did Abraham Mapu or Naftali Herz Linder. It's simply because they were not tormented in their countries of residence, like the Jews of Russia, or the Jews of Poland, or the Jews of Romania. It is significant, I think, that in this last political text, which my father openly called his political will testament, he offered his conciliatory hand to Mizrahi Israeli Jews, and also to moderate right-wing Israeli Jews, and to Jewish believers in God, and to Palestinians and to Arabs, but not to Europe. Not at all to Europe. On the contrary, he seems to have deepened and toughened his earlier claim that Europe could be responsible not only for some very good seeds and ideas in Israeli society and culture, but also to very bad outcomes, including the Ashkenazi-Mizrahi tension, and the left-right hostility in part, and of course the Israeli-Palestinian conflict itself. Europe is partially to blame. In fact, Europe is first and foremost, in a negative way, the fundamental cause of Zionism. Also in a positive way because it invented modern nationalism, or the softer form of national sentiment. Harnessed to the idea of territory, of the modern sovereign state, of national cultures ensconced in the modern sovereign state, national language, majority cultures overpowering or subjecting minority cultures in the modern sovereign state. All this is in the realm of ideas and did help to form the embryonic model for the modern state of Israel. So the modern state of Israel as a modern state, as a modern nation state, is an idea born in Europe. All this is historically true, but it is not the only and not even the most important reason why Europe gave birth to Zionism and gave birth to it in a cruel, aggressive, inhumanly monstrous way. In my own words, Europe was the mother of Israel in the sense that Paideia was the mother of her children. Europe is a fundamental cause of Zionism, Amos Oz asserted, because it left its Jews no other option but three in the early 20th century: to flee, to become Zionist, or to die. And then, in the 1930s, it deprived them of the option to flee, left them only with the options to become Zionists or to die. And finally, in the first half of the 1940s, it was too late for them even to become Zionists, and they died. I quote, "Fathers and mothers, and your fathers and mothers," he told his Israeli audience, "for 2,000 years, said in every Pesach Seder, Lashana Habaa Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. This is true, but if they they had not been persecuted and tormented and humiliated and murdered, they would have said this for another 2,000 years and stayed in their own places and not come to the land of Israel. Unquote. Thus, I can testify that Oz never abandoned his view formed for him by his parents in his early childhood and had throughout his life in numerous writings and lectures in Israel and abroad and of course all across Europe, that Europe was the Jews' chief historical enemy as well as their modernizer and the cradle of their modern nation. He treated Europe as a collective in this respect, but we are talking about deep end Europe, not a collection of states or political societies, but some kind of a deep end cultural historical entity. Yes, this is essentialist, and that was the writer's privilege, not the historians, to treat Europe in an essentialist way. My father also believed until the end of his life that both Jews and Arabs had been victims of Europe's racism, imperialism, and colonialism. But alas, victims do not automatically become friends through the solidarity of a shared tormentor. Nor did he abandon his view that Christianity rather than Islam was Judaism's arch enemy, the most pivotal points of medieval and modern history. He had been saying this a lot, but in his last lecture, this was a newly sharpened statement. And with this, I will also end the resounding of my father's voice. You see, he also took Europe's persecution of its Jews, especially in the early 20th century, to be the one decisive justification for Zionism. Because at the end of the day, in the deep well of moral reckoning, Zionism is not justified in his mind by the historical longing, by the 2,000 years, by Lashana Haba'a B'Yerushalayim, certainly not by the religious or the mystical connectivity of Jews around the world to their ancestral homeland. Not even the Hebrew language or biblical geography that kept them on a cultural geographic azimuth, an eastern wall to pray at, a legacy of physical longing, a spiritual, a poetic compass, Yehuda Halevi's heart in the east and body in the far west. All of these were wonderful cultural assets to him. Wonderful longings, poetically beautiful continuities, but they are not the core justification of Zionism. The only real justification was Europe's persecution of the Jews, followed by Muslim countries' persecution of their Jews. And of course the eventual genocide of the Jews following in the 1940s and 50s by the Arab countries attitude was their own resident Jews. A lethal imitation of Europe's primeval sin. So to put it very succinctly, Zionism is justified not because of 2 millennia of cultural longing, and not because of the early Aliyot and modern Hebrew and the kibbutz and Tel Aviv, all which are considered wonderful accomplishments of Zionism. It is justified because by the time European Jews were drowning in the 1930s, most of them were not eligible for sanctuary in a single country in the world, except for a few lucky ones. A few went to Canada, to Australia. Switzerland accepted a handful. And there are some other examples. But the main voice was the voice, which he calls in his lecture, of the South African Field Marshal Jan Smuts, who famously said that his country can avoid despicable anti-Semitism only by avoiding Jews. We have the same story about Australia, that not totally true, of course. So by elimination, by dire necessity, by zero alternatives and well-founded existential fear, Palestine, Eretz Israel, was the last resort safe haven. Not really a resort, not really a haven, but the only place they could still run to. And he's talking about my 4 grandparents, his parents. My ultra-Zionist, Jabotinskayite great-grandfather, my father's grandfather, only came here from anti-Semitic Poland in the mid-30s, here to Israel, because his family was refused entry visas to every country he applied to, including the United States, including, by the way, Germany. The moral reasoning of Zionism for my father was strictly the justification of the drowning man clutching a small piece of driftwood on the water, already occupied by another man, and claiming part of it, just part, in order to survive. Drowning man and the driftwood. That's the only condition for Zionism's raison d'etre. It is both a necessary condition and a sufficient condition. Hence the moral political requirement today that the driftwood be shared between its 2 occupiers. And with this moral political demand, my father lived and died. That's as far as I go with Amos. I will close with him, but I felt I owe him this. My talk is not about justifications to Zionism, but about the absolute necessity of an ongoing Israeli-European conversation, despite past evil and despite the present-day limbo. Let me begin, as promised, by seeing what is old and what is new in this Israeli-European deep end. Of course, I am standing on the shoulders of great scholars. We have now a very decent bookshelf, both literary and academic, and an ever-broadening research on Israeli-European relations from many aspects and angles. I have been looking at what I've earlier called the deep end of these relations, the cultural, historical, mythical, and the emotional context. It can transform any old international relations into a labyrinth of memory and hypersensitivity. Also, Europe as a concept, in the eyes of Europeans and in the eyes of Israelis, is a major factor in the labyrinth of memory and hypersensitivity. Of course, I would like to acknowledge and commend earlier scholarly works, Sachar, Manfred Gerstenfeld, of course, Uda Reinhardt and Yaakov Shavit in their glorious Accused Europe, more recently Michael Brenner, David Ohana in intellectual history, many others, some of them here present. Of course, my list is very crisp. I will not, I think, be disrespectful if I argue that part of my father's Europe concept, Europe as it had been in his own eyes and early Zionist and Israeli eyes, is obsolete. To call Europe today the eternal historical menace to the Jews, or a geocultural entity where Judas, the wandering Jew, Shiloh, even Daniel Gironda, and now the state of Israel personified, is a perpetual feed for ongoing anti-Semitism. I cannot and will not say this because I'm not an essentialist. I do not think that since the rise of European Christianity and until the end of times, ahistorically, immovably, dangerously, Europe has and will keep hating the Jews. or Israel as the Jew persona. To do this would be to make Europe, we don't talk about essentialism, but let me use my ancient Greek friends here. I'm not taking the Talmudic rabbis, although they also have some interesting things to say, but Plato and Aristotle. To say that Europe is something permanent, eternal, and unchanging, at least vis-a-vis its Jewish nemesis, is to make it into a Platonic object rather than an Aristotelian object. You see, the Platonic object contains its essence from eternity. There is nothing you can do about changing it. But the Aristotelian object changes itself, transforms itself, remains recognizable, but passes through many different stages. This is historical, this is empirical, this is my attitude as well. There are still many Israelis who hold on to the Platonic essentialism. For them, the murderous Europe who is still conniving to annihilate both its Jewish inhabitants and the state of Israel as a megaton. But even they have to recognize that new things are happening, for better and for worse. The eternal object that is Europe, the eternal myth that is Europe, is changing from within, not necessarily for better or worse, but changing. So what, in my own empirical, Aristotelian, changing view of Europe, what has remained with us today from my grandparents' beloved and lethal, murderous and fascinating Europe? I do not think that the recent reawakening of extreme nationalist politics in European countries, within the European Union and outside it, are linked, I do think that they are linked to the past by many streams. I do think that white racism and fortress Europe are linked to the past by many streams. But ours is a new time. Europe is a transformed and transforming entity, not necessarily for the better, not necessarily for the worse. Not least because its liberalism is now warring against its chauvinism in new ways, in new situations. I see no historical determinism either in European anti-Semitism or in its other traits. Nor do I see determinism in any other historical process whatsoever. So what has dramatically changed since the first European-Israeli conversations since 1945 and 1948? First, the broad European agreement, historically in Western Europe, more recently in Eastern Europe, about Israel's justifiability and justice. It has narrowed to some degree. If most of Europe, including those who did not vote for Israel's late success in November 47, still thought that Israel was both just and justifiable as a state and as a society, this platform has narrowed somewhat. As the polls show us, many more millions still find justice in Israel's existence, but not in its fundamental policies towards Palestinians in the last decades. A large number does not even bother to distinguish between existential justification and present-day political justice. This is a relatively novel transformation, sown in the 1970s, disseminated in the 1990s, and overgrown today. It is adamantly not the policy of the vast majority of European countries and governments, nor of the EU, or the backbone of European cultural outputs today. It is, however, a media and intelligentsia staple, and its ferocity is growing. So denying Israel's right to exist, I propose, is a narrow part of Europe's opinion landscape, but it is newly ferocious. New too is the willingness of many Israelis to give up Europe, to abandon the Ben-Gurionite faith in a new partnership with Europe. And as we know, Ben-Gurion pointedly believed in a new partnership with Germany, not just with the rest of Europe, or Western Europe at the time. To despair today of any stable and committed friendship with any European country at all. And I'm not speaking for the academic elite here. I'm not speaking for the Israeli elite at all. I'm speaking for the thousands of Israelis that I hear and read on Twitter, in the media, in the internet forums, on the bus. This vast majority of Israelis, many of them vote for the right and many of them vote for the left, have despaired of Europe, have lost what I've just called the Ben-Gurionite optimism. This is not true for the elite and for academia. New is a misinformed conviction fed by media and social media and political chatter and fake news that Europe today is back to the old view, always and forever. In other words, Israelis have recently re-embraced the old essentialist image of Europe, an image that early Israel was eager to lay to rest. Bad old Europe is back, and this is new because, paradoxically as it may sound, the revival of essentialism in every aspect that we need today, including race and gender, national character, and culture wars, this revival of essentialism is itself a new phase in our history. Relatively recent too is the refusal of tens of thousands of young Israelis to accept any essentialism, old or new. And these young Israelis are not the Israelis I have just mentioned. Not those who are telling us that there is an anti-Semitic Europe forevermore, and it's only the masks that have changed, from the old Polish peasants to the Nazis, and now to the Muslims and their left-wing supporters, in the crude language of this part of Israeli society. There is also another part of Israeli society, tens of thousands of young Israelis who refuse to accept essentialism, old and new. The Israeli migration is not exactly a migration. It is more like the digital life of a world citizen, a transnational, a temporary expat, maybe an eternal expat. It's not the old-fashioned migration. So this Israeli move to Europe, or embracing of Europe, physical and cultural, the literal, cinematic, musical, artistic lifelines, especially between Tel Aviv and Berlin, but generally between Israel and Europe. Nurtured by history, but novel in their quality, pace, and accessibility. Every day in Ben Gurion Airport, European Jews arriving to live in Israel, having despaired of Europe, intercross this section in the Ben Gurion Airport, intercross on the automatic walkways, with Israelis, especially young Israelis, moving in the other direction. This, too, is relatively new. And I'm not judging it. And if I would judge it, I would judge it positively. I think that Israeli normality has to do with an Israeli diaspora around the world, with Hebrew literature being written as it is written today in Berlin and Stanford, with Hebrew poetry and drama being compiled and shown in London and in Sydney. It's okay for me, but we can argue about that. If this is new, both a newly powerful essentialism anti-European feeling forces Israel, the return of the old anti-Semitism, the Nazi disguise as a Muslim, and the younger Israeli generation willing to embrace Europe sometimes and into these two directions are both new. What has remained essentially and deeply unchanged from the Israeli perspective, I suggest, is the deep-set Jewish fears that have never ceased, only perhaps run underground for a few decades, the deep suspicions of the permanence of anti-Semitism, the unceasing fear that the Zionist project may fail, may fall, either physically or morally, and that this horrible possible failure, some Israelis already think that it has failed, but they are not sure. This horrible failure deeply involves Europe as the bad ferry boat model, or as the future haven, or as the locus of the past diaspora as well as the future diaspora. This is not an Ashkenazi phenomenon. A European neurosis can be seen in the current young generation of Israeli Jews regardless of origin. Even some Palestinians are part of this geopolitics of neurosis as well. Of this, by the way, the leader-to-leader method may work better. Who knows? It is already beginning to work better for Saudi Arabia and Iran. In regards to trying to balance the Israeli orientation between Europe and the Middle East, as a cultural matter, these are two souls residing in our Israeli breast. And we know that we've been fighting it out for the last Israelis and our different identities for the last 70 or 80 years. But who can open the conversation in the Middle East now? Unfortunately, I say it is totally against the grain of my own beliefs, if not the leaders. I'm putting a hard truth here. It is against the grain of what most of us wish. But it is the time of the leaders, and they are talking to some people.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't think I'm making it work. Can you hear me?
If you raise your voice a little
Okay,
bit.
so I'll do it without the microphone. Thank you so much for these very thoughtful reflections. My name is Csaba Nikolényi. I'm from the Concordia University in Montreal, and also a new member of the group of Israelis who are now living in Berlin. But that's a long story. Let me start with a very brief preliminary, because you also did that, and you mentioned, Fania, that you usually don't bring into your talks your father, but I can't resist offering something back in exchange for you that hopefully you will take with yourself. Every summer I bring a group of my Canadian students to spend a month in Jerusalem at the Hebrew University with me. And this year one of my students, a Roman Catholic from Venezuela, left Venezuela, she's never going to go back. She had the assignment of presenting about Amos Oz, his biography. And this was at the last session of the course. She walks into the classroom with a teaspoon in her pocket. And I'm going to stop here with the preliminary. And then she told, of course, the whole class about Amos Oz and the history of the teaspoon movement, and it brought many people to tears. So that's something I wanted to share with you as a warm story. My more difficult question is the seemingly stark, and I think false distinction between leaders and societies. Leaders are as much the shapers of their societies as they are the products thereof. What do you have to say about that?
I don't totally agree. This kind of causality does not go against the point made here that ours is an age of leaders for many different reasons. Of course there are products of their societies, and in some ways an unexpected product. Donald Trump rose from an unexpected part of America. But there it is. You know, in terms of the sources and origins of this effect and power, now we have unraveled it. So of course the causality is there on both sides. The question is, who is the stronger actor today? And I chose to put this thought in here instead of giving you a nice cultural kind of keynote, because I think that this is a truth that many of us academics or liberals or modern individuals, caring and active citizens find very difficult to face. By the way, my father on this, there were two Amos Oz's. And to be very frank, there was one wonderful Amos Oz who invented the metaphor of the teaspoon, and since you mentioned it, I'll tell it to everyone. We may not have anything in our hands as ordinary people, as ordinary citizens. We cannot change the world, we cannot change the history. If we are flooded by evil, what can we do? But every person has a teaspoon. Take the teaspoon and start working with it. to undo the floods or the tsunami of bad events. If every person used 1 teaspoon, we would be able to dry those wounds, he said. And this was so effective, this metaphor, especially in Sweden, that some good Swedish people found that the order of the teaspoon, and people walk around carrying a little, I've got one of my own, but I keep losing it, a little teaspoon, we have to do something. But this is only the one answer. And let me be toughly frank again. The other Amos Oz was the one who went and had tough conversations with every Israeli prime minister from Ben-Gurion to Yitzhak Rabin, that was very stopped. He never went to Netanyahu. He met Barak and Olmert and Sharon, he saw Olmert. He never went to have a tough conversation with Netanyahu. He despaired on that. But he understood something of the old-fashioned historical truism that leaders, regardless of how they rose, regardless of the social causality and cultural causality that brought them up, leaders are the main game changers in many moments in history. Sometimes they are not, but more often they are. Sometimes, as in Israel, the murderer of the leader is the one who changed history single-handedly. But that only goes to show how powerful the leader was. I am not giving you an easy morsel before supper. This is very difficult to say. But the people-to-people charm of the teaspoon metaphor, of everything so many of us have been trying to do in academia and education, in NGOs, in civil society, it's to be treasured. But right now it is being less victorious and less successful than 20 and 30 years ago. This is why we need to aim at leaderships today and to reinvent the way society can impact leadership. But it is the leaders who at the end of the day, where we live now, where we stand now, make the decisions. Except Boris Johnson.
Last question.
Yes, yeah.
Fania, first of all, thank you so much. You spoke at the beginning about a line, sorry. Okay.
First of all, thank you very, very much for this wonderful talk. At one of the first parts of your talk, you spoke about a number of researchers that speak about Europe as a source of evil towards the Jews, and that it doesn't change along the way. And the problem, and you were offering a sort of a more optimistic view about a change in the dialogue and that we all hope for. I think a recent problem is that antisemitism is on the rise, and especially in Western Europe, in a way that brings back these Israeli and Jewish notions about a Europe that doesn't change. It doesn't. Here it is again. Here it is again, and you so colorfully showed us Jews from Europe who despair and come to Ben-Gurion, and they go parallel to youngsters who go to Berlin. Youngsters are coming back from the Berlin. That is true right now. They are coming back, and they don't consider Berlin a paradise as they did before. So here is the point that it strengthens these researchers or these people. And I would like to mention in this regard and in general a page in סיפור לאהבה וחושך, a tale about love and darkness. I don't have to tell you, it's a masterpiece. And there is an unforgettable description of the vote in the United Nations, November 1947, and how all the radios are open, and how all Jerusalem goes out dance, and your grandfather takes little Amos goes out, time out, yes, and then when they come back, said so, he saw for the first time ever tears on his father's cheek. He said, what? And the father tells him about how he was humiliated in his school in Vilna. They took off his pants. His father came to complain. He took his pants as well, and then said, the father, your grandfather, took Amos. Anti-Semitism will be forever. Problems with the Arabs, forever. But regarding anti-Semitism, what's new after this vote is our rejection. Our rejection. It will go on, but we will not let it humiliate us again. So that's the perspective.
Lina, it is a beautiful part of the book. Thank you for reminding me. It is also one of the most famous parts of the book. And what can I do? I have to disagree with my grandfather and even with my father. I would not like to see a timeless history, a kind of a meta-history, in which the eternal Jew walks forever, hand in hand, with the eternal anti-Semite until the end of times. I'm sorry that I'm not there. I respect my grandfather. I know exactly what happened to him in Vilna, and what happened to the family in Odessa, and what happened in school that caused him to say these things to my father in November, on the 29th of November 47. And maybe he was right from this point. But I cannot accept either essentialism attitude or the essentiality of Europe as an Islamic Europe, or the Jews as its perpetual victims. And I think that Zionism did not only try to change the geographic location of the Jews and their militarization so that they are definitely protected from anti-Semitism. I want to remind you that Herzl's Zionism was about eradicating anti-Semitism, which has failed so far in Zionism. And the idea was that the Jew will stay on, but the anti-Semite will disappear from the face of the earth. And what can I say? I'm not giving up on this. I don't want the boat to disappear. If both disappear, I'd rather they both stay. But can't we envisage what I call the early Ben-Gurionite Israel, which was so optimistic in the shade of a horrible trauma which it was not really fully understand, was so optimistic that it truly believed, like Herzl's Autonomian, that the Jew will remain and the anti-Semite will disappear, because he will become a fan. At least so long as the Jews are in their country. So what I'm trying to say is exactly this, that I would not like to see the return of essentialist Europe, which is forever anti-Semitic, but always in new garbs. Sometimes wearing a Catholic priest's hood, and sometimes Nazi uniform, and now a kafir. But it goes on and on. I would not like this demo to reach my grandchildren. And I know that my grandparents hoped that this demo will not follow me, but it is following me. But that's something also for Europe's conversation among itself, within itself. You know, Sami was asking me rightly about conversation of Israel and the Middle East. But I'm giving two answers here. Europe should have a conversation with itself about Israel and the Middle East. And maybe the Arab countries should have a conversation with themselves about Israel and the Middle East. I know that we are the big talkers. I know that we are the big mouths. Maybe some other people should talk to each other. But having said all that, you know, Jews have not perhaps significantly changed into Israelis of the time grandparents. We are not tall, suntan, and silent, except for belly dance. He's tall, sometimes silent. But most of us are not. And by the way, it's not such a bad thing that he's relatively silent, but we'll see after the minutes. We have not transformed. But Europe is transforming all the time, so why not for the better? Any other comments or questions?
Thank you so much again also for this whole debate, and I hope we will have all the chance to continue on our networking that we are moving right now. It's in the, for those of you who are locals at the Paris University Historical Building at Oz Meter 4. For those of you who are not local, just stick to us and don't. Maybe, yes. And then, first of all, we will take a good picture. We'll be for all of us.